Before we begin, if you have ever encountered someone whose faith made them harder to be around rather than easier, if you have ever watched religion become a weapon rather than a balm, if you have ever sat inside a spiritual community and felt, quietly and uncomfortably, that something about the atmosphere felt more like hierarchy than holiness, or if, and this takes real courage to admit, you have ever recognized that energy in yourself, this conversation is one you cannot afford to skip. And if Empire of the Mind is the channel that goes where the comfortable channels won't subscribe right now, hit that bell, turn on every notification. Because what we are about to explore sits at the intersection of psychology, spirituality, and the kind of ruthless self-honesty that genuine faith has always demanded and religious pride has always avoided. Let's begin. There is a particular kind of person who is certain they are humble. They will tell you so, frequently, with great confidence. They will describe, at length, how they have surrendered their ego to God, to the universe, to the higher power of their tradition, how they have laid down their pride at the altar, how they are merely a servant, a vessel, an instrument of something greater than themselves. And yet, in the very act of telling you all of this, something else is unmistakably present. Something that watches to see if you are sufficiently impressed by their humility. Something that measures your spiritual development against their own and finds yours, quietly, wanting. Something that has decided, not always consciously, but with remarkable consistency, that their access to divine truth is more direct, more reliable, and more authoritative than yours. Carl Jung had a name for that something. He called it the ego wearing the costume of the self, and he considered it one of the most dangerous psychological conditions a human being could inhabit. Not because it makes people obviously cruel, though sometimes it does, but because it makes people invisibly cruel in ways they cannot see, in ways they would be genuinely horrified to recognize, precisely because they have organized their entire identity around the conviction that they are the opposite of cruel. This is the danger of religious pride. Not the pride that knows itself as pride, but the pride that has been baptized, ordained, and given a theology, and now moves through the world, convinced it is holiness. To understand what Jung would say about this, we have to begin with one of his most important and most misunderstood concepts: inflation. Psychological inflation, in Jungian terms, is what happens when the ego, the conscious, managing center of the personality, becomes identified with something larger than itself, when it loses its appropriate sense of scale and begins to believe that it is the thing it has merely encountered. Jung observed this happening in two directions. A person can be inflated upward, identifying with the divine, with a special mission, with unique spiritual authority. Or they can be inflated downward, identified with their wound, their victimhood, their unworthiness. Both are forms of inflation. Both are the ego losing its appropriate relationship to the self. Religious pride is almost always a form of upward inflation, and it is extraordinarily seductive because it does not feel like pride. It feels like conviction. It feels like faithfulness. It feels like the appropriate response to having received something genuinely true and genuinely precious. Here is the mechanism, and it is worth following carefully. A person has a genuine spiritual experience, a real one, an encounter with something that feels larger than themselves. Call it God, call it grace, call it the numinous, which was Jung's preferred term for the overwhelming, awe-inducing quality of a genuine encounter with the sacred. This experience is real. It is transformative. It produces, in the beginning, exactly what genuine spiritual experience should produce: humility, gratitude, a sense of being loved beyond all deserving, a desire to live differently. But then something happens. The ego, which was temporarily displaced by the experience, temporarily cracked open and made receptive, reasserts itself, and instead of remaining in the position of the one who received the experience, the ego begins to identify with it. Instead of saying, "Something vast and holy passed through me," the ego begins to say, "I am someone who has access to something vast and holy." And that shift, almost imperceptible, rarely consciously chosen, is the birth of religious pride. The experience was real. The inflation of the ego around the experience is the distortion. And once that inflation takes hold, the genuine spiritual experience becomes paradoxically, tragically, the very thing that closes the person off from further genuine growth. Because you cannot continue to be transformed by what you believe you have already mastered. Now let's bring in Jung's concept of the shadow, because religious pride and the shadow are inextricably connected. And understanding that connection is what makes this entire conversation practically useful rather than merely intellectually interesting. Every human being, as we have explored many times on this channel, carries a shadow, the unconscious accumulation of everything the developing self has rejected, suppressed, or refused to acknowledge. And one of the ego's primary functions is to maintain a coherent, consistent, acceptable self-image, to keep the story of who we are from being disrupted by the inconvenient reality of who we also are. Now consider what happens to the shadow inside a religious or spiritual framework that is organized around moral purity, around being good, being righteous, being chosen, being further along than the unenlightened world around you. The shadow does not disappear in that environment. It goes deeper. It becomes denser. It gets pushed further into the unconscious by the tremendous weight of the spiritual identity pressing down on top of it. Every time anger surfaces and is immediately suppressed because anger is unspiritual, the shadow grows. Every time envy is felt and instantly shamed into silence, the shadow grows. Every time lust or greed or the quiet pleasure of feeling superior, every time these are experienced and immediately buried under a layer of prayer or repentance or doctrinal assurance, the shadow grows. And a large, dense, unacknowledged shadow in a person with a large inflation-filled spiritual persona is one of the most psychologically volatile combinations that exists. Jung observed this with clinical precision. The more rigidly a person maintained a persona of moral and spiritual superiority, the more violently their shadow tended to erupt when it finally found a way to the surface. The televangelist who preaches against the very sins he is secretly practicing, the spiritual guru who speaks of unconditional love and controls his community with fear, the devout churchgoer whose private life is a landscape of cruelty, the religious leader whose theology of grace coexists with remarkable comfort, alongside contempt for the very people grace was supposed to reach. These are not hypocrites in the simple, dismissible sense. They are people in the grip of a profound Jungian dynamic. The bigger the persona, the bigger the shadow, and they are as trapped by it as they are dangerous because of it. Because when a person's shadow is acting out through the cover of spiritual authority, neither they nor the people around them recognize it as shadow. They call it righteous anger, divine discipline, godly confrontation, spiritual warfare. And the unconscious mechanism continues, unchallenged, because it has been given a theological justification. Let's talk now about what Jung called individuation, and why it is the only genuine antidote to religious pride. Individuation, as we've explored, is the lifelong process of becoming who you actually are, of integrating the shadow, of withdrawing projections, of dismantling the persona, not destroying it, but seeing through it, so that it no longer operates as an unconscious master, but as a conscious tool. And Jung was very specific about what genuine individuation does to a person's relationship with their own spiritual convictions. It does not destroy faith. In fact, Jung was a deeply religious man in his own complex, non-institutional way, and he believed that genuine encounter with the self was the closest thing to a genuine encounter with God that a human being could have. He did not want to eliminate spiritual experience. He wanted to deepen it. But deepening it required something that religious pride specifically prevents: the willingness to be wrong about yourself. Not wrong about God, not wrong about the tradition, not wrong about the values and convictions that have genuinely shaped and guided your life, but wrong about the most seductive belief that religious pride produces: the belief that your access to truth makes you a better, more authoritative, more spiritually credible human being than the person next to you. Jung would say that genuine spiritual maturity always produces the opposite movement. The person who is genuinely growing in consciousness does not become more certain of their superiority. They become more aware of their complexity, more honest about the shadow they carry, more capable of sitting with ambiguity, with mystery, with the uncomfortable possibility that the divine is larger than their doctrine, and that the person they most look down upon may be carrying a truth they have not yet been humble enough to receive. This is what the mystics of every tradition have always known, and it is what religious pride, by its very structure, makes impossible to access. Because pride, at its core, is a closed system. It has already decided what is true, who has it, and how it is distributed. There is no room in it for surprise, no room for the sacred to arrive in an unexpected form, no room for the possibility that God or truth or wisdom or grace might be present in the person you have theologically classified as lesser. I want to speak now to those of you who are inside religious or spiritual communities, because this is where the rubber meets the road, and it is where Jung's insights become not just intellectually interesting, but personally urgent. There are signs. Jung would call them markers of inflation, and they are worth examining honestly, not in your neighbor, not in your pastor, not in the person whose theology you already distrust, but in yourself. Do you find that your spiritual development has made you more patient with human imperfection or less? Do you find that your faith has made you more curious about perspectives different from your own, or more dismissive of them? When someone challenges your beliefs, do you experience it as an invitation to examine them, or as an attack to be defended against? Do you find that your certainty about spiritual matters has become a source of connection with other human beings, or a wall between you and anyone who does not share your framework? Is your faith a place you go to be undone, to be humbled, to be challenged, to be made more aware of your own insufficiency? Or has it become a place you go to be confirmed? And perhaps most penetratingly, the question Jung would sit with in the consulting room, the question that cuts beneath every defense: who are you when your spiritual identity is not in the room? If that question produces anxiety rather than curiosity, if the thought of your spiritual identity being stripped away feels more like annihilation than liberation, that, Jung would say, is the ego speaking, not the self. The ego, terrified of the very nakedness that a genuine encounter with the sacred has always required. Here is what Jung believed: genuine faith, faith that has been individuated, faith that has wrestled with its own shadow, faith that has survived the humiliation of discovering how much the ego has contaminated it here, is what he believed it actually looks like. It looks like a person who holds their convictions deeply and their certainty lightly. Who can say I believe this with everything I have and simultaneously say I may not have the full picture? Who has learned the difference between the numinous experience that initiated their faith, that real, undeniable encounter with something larger than themselves, and the ego structure they built around that experience afterward? It looks like a person whose spirituality makes them softer rather than harder, more porous to other people's reality. more capable of genuine compassion, not the compassion that looks down while it reaches out, but the compassion that looks across. Eye to eye, soul to soul. It looks like a person who has met their own shadow and is no longer terrified of it, and therefore no longer needs to project it onto unbelievers, onto sinners, onto the theologically incorrect, onto anyone whose existence threatens the carefully maintained edifice of their spiritual self-image. Jung wrote that the most important question any person can ask is not, "Do I believe the right things?" but "Am I becoming more whole, more integrated, more honest, more genuinely present to the complexity of being human, more capable of love that does not require the beloved to be like me to be worthy of it?" That question, "Am I becoming more whole?" is the question that religious pride cannot ask, because it already knows the answer. It decided the answer long before the question was asked. And genuine faith, the kind that descends rather than ascends, the kind that empties rather than fills, the kind that every authentic mystical tradition has been pointing toward since the beginning of human spiritual history, genuine faith begins precisely where religious pride ends. In the willingness to not know, to not be the most righteous person in the room, to not have God in your pocket, to be, instead, simply and profoundly, and without performance, a human being, seeking, still. That seeking humble, honest, ongoing, and unafraid of what it might find is what Jung would call the beginning of real faith, and it is available to all of us. The moment we are willing to lay down the version of ourselves that is too proud to need it. If this landed somewhere real in you today, if it cracked something open that needed cracking, then you know why Empire of the Mind exists. Subscribe to this channel. Join a growing community of people who are committed to the kind of self-examination that genuine spiritual life has always required, and religious pride has always resisted. Every video we release is a tool for that examination, a Jungian lens, a psychological framework, a mirror held up to the parts of our inner lives we would rather not see. Subscribe. Share this with someone brave enough to ask hard questions about the faith they hold, because brave questions are not the enemy of faith. They are its deepest expression. They always have been. The empire we are building is not built on certainty. It is built on the courage to keep seeking even when, especially when, what we find unsettles everything we thought we already knew. Subscribe, and we will keep going deeper, together.